The smell of fresh coffee and warm bagels filled the small downtown shelter as Maya finished setting up for another busy morning. She hadn't planned on becoming a social worker, but life has its own way of leading you where you're meant to be. 5 years ago, she was working in corporate marketing, wearing fancy suits and chasing deadlines. Now, her daily uniform consisted of comfortable sneakers and a worn denim jacket with pockets deep enough to carry granola bars for the hungry teens who'd wander in. That Tuesday started like any other. The March rain tapped against the windows, creating a gentle rhythm as Maya sorted through donation boxes. Old Mrs. Thompson from the bakery down the street had just dropped off day-old pastries, and the familiar faces of regular shelter visitors were starting to trickle in. "Hey kiddo," Maya called out to a newcomer who'd been showing up for the past week. The girl couldn't have been more than 16, with a threadbare backpack clutched tight against her chest. They hadn't talked much yet, but Maya had noticed how the girl's eyes would light up at the sight of chocolate chip muffins. The morning crowd was just settling in when Maya heard the commotion outside. Through the shelter's foggy windows, she saw 2 police officers approaching the same young girl who'd just walked past her. Something felt off. The girl's body language changed instantly. Shoulders hunched, trying to make herself smaller. Maya's heart started racing. She'd seen this scene play out before, but something about today felt different. Maybe it was the way Officer Stevens, she recognized him from his regular patrols, was moving too aggressively. Or maybe it was the look of pure terror in the girl's eyes. Without thinking, Maya grabbed her phone from the desk. Her hands were trembling, but she managed to hit record just as things escalated. The officers were demanding ID, their voices getting louder. The girl was trying to explain that her backpack, with all her documents, had been stolen at another shelter last week. Maya had helped her file a police report about it just yesterday. "I have the report number," the girl's voice cracked. "I can show you." But before she could finish, Officer Stevens grabbed her arm. The other officer moved to block the view from the street, but Maya's angle from the shelter doorway caught everything. The girl wasn't resisting, wasn't fighting back. She was crying, trying to explain, but they weren't listening. Maya's finger pressed harder on the record button. Her mind raced through options. Should she intervene? Call someone? The girl's eyes met hers through the glass, and in that moment, Maya knew she couldn't just stand there. "Wait." Maya pushed through the door, phone still recording. "I can verify her story. We filed a report yesterday about her stolen ID. I have all the documentation inside." The officers paused, but Officer Stevens didn't release his grip. "Ma'am, this is a police matter. Please step back inside." "I'm the shelter coordinator." Maya kept her voice steady despite her racing heart. "This is Rachel. She's been coming here for breakfast all week. I can prove she filed that report. Just give me 2 minutes to get the paperwork." Something in her tone must have reached them. The newer officer, Maya didn't recognize him, glanced uncertainly at his partner. Officer Stevens's jaw clenched, but he loosened his hold on the girl's arm. 2 minutes, he barked. Maya's hands shook as she dug through yesterday's files, but she found the report. As she handed it over, she realized she was still recording. The video captured everything. The gradual shift in the officer's demeanor as they verified the report, the girl's quiet sobs turning to hiccups, and finally, reluctantly, their departure. The girl, Rachel, collapsed into Maya's arms as soon as the police car pulled away. Other shelter visitors gathered around, offering tissues, water, quiet words of support. Maya held her phone tight, knowing that what she just captured was more than just a video. It was proof. Proof of what happened in these moments when nobody was watching. Or at least, when nobody was supposed to be watching. Later that night, after ensuring Rachel was safely settled in the shelter's emergency bed, Maya sat in her small apartment staring at her phone. The video seemed to burn in her hand. 3 minutes and 42 seconds that could change everything. Or nothing. She thought about Officer Stevens, about how he looked right through Rachel like she wasn't even human. She thought about all the other Rachels out there, all the other moments no one saw. Her finger hovered over the share button. The consequences started playing through her mind. Her job could be at risk. The shelter might face backlash. Officer Stevens knew where she worked, knew her face. The thought made her stomach twist. But then she remembered Rachel's eyes. The way she'd whispered "thank you" over and over, not for the bed or the food, but for being seen, for having someone witness what happened to her and not look away. Maya took a deep breath and pressed share. She typed a simple caption: "This happened today outside downtown Hope Shelter. No one should be treated this way. Hashtag accountability." As she hit post, she didn't know that across town, Officer Stevens was filing his own report about a routine stop. She didn't know that in a few hours, her video would reach thousands, then hundreds of thousands. She didn't know that her life was about to change forever. She just knew that for once she'd done more than watch. She'd acted. The rain had stopped outside her window, but Maya couldn't sleep. She made herself a cup of tea and curled up on her worn couch, her phone silent but somehow louder than ever. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring. For tonight, she just hoped Rachel was sleeping peacefully in the shelter bed, knowing that someone had stood up for her. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest choices. For Maya, it started with pressing record. For Rachel, it started with someone finally seeing her. And for the city they called home, it was about to start a conversation that couldn't be ignored. The clock ticked past midnight, and Maya finally drifted off to sleep, her phone clutched in her hand. The video was already spreading across social media, carrying its uncomfortable truth into thousands of homes. By morning, nothing would be the same. But that's a story for another day. In the shelter's quiet halls, the security cameras blinked their steady red lights, recording another night like any other. Except this night wasn't like any other. This night, someone had chosen to act. This night, someone had chosen to see. And sometimes, that's all it takes to start a revolution. Maya woke up to her phone buzzing like an angry bee. The morning sun was barely peeking through her curtains when she saw the numbers. 147 missed calls, 892 text messages, and thousands of notifications from social media. Her heart jumped into her throat as she remembered last night's video. The first message was from her boss. "Come in early, we need to talk." Her hands shook as she made coffee, spilling grounds on the counter. The video had been shared over 50,000 times overnight. News channels were tagging her in posts. Her inbox was flooded with messages from journalists, activists, and strangers, some supportive, others not so much. "Just breathe," she whispered to herself, grabbing her denim jacket. The same one she'd worn yesterday, though it felt like a lifetime ago. As she walked to work, she noticed how different everything looked. Was that car following her? Why was that person staring? The morning air felt heavy with unseen eyes. The shelter's familiar brick building came into view, but something was different. News vans lined the street. Reporters clutched coffee cups and microphones, their heads turning in unison as she approached. A forest of cameras pointed her way. "Are you the one who posted the video? What made you decide to record? Have the officers contacted you? Do you fear retaliation?" Maya ducked her head and pushed through the crowd, fumbling with her keys. Inside, her boss waited by the front desk, face drawn with worry. "The mayor's office called," he said without preamble. "The police chief wants a meeting, and our funding partners are concerned about potential backlash." Maya's stomach dropped. "I couldn't just—" "I know," he cut her off, but his voice was gentle. "I saw the video. You did the right thing. But this is bigger than us now, and we need to be smart about how we handle it." Before she could respond, Rachel appeared in the doorway of the common room. She looked small in borrowed shelter clothes, but her eyes were clear and determined. "I want to tell my story," she said quietly. "The whole story, not just what happened yesterday." The morning became a blur of phone calls and decisions. A civil rights lawyer offered pro bono representation. Community organizers reached out with support. The shelter's regular visitors formed a protective circle around Maya and Rachel, screening calls and turning away aggressive reporters. But not all the responses were supportive. By midday, Maya found her car's tires slashed in the parking lot. Anonymous accounts flooded her social media with threats. Someone posted her home address in a police support group. "You can stay with me," offered Mrs. Thompson from the bakery, her lined face fierce with protective anger. "My spare room's small, but it's safe." The police chief's statement hit the news at 2 p.m. "We take all allegations of misconduct seriously. The officers involved have been placed on administrative duty pending investigation." The words felt hollow, rehearsed. Maya watched Officer Stevens giving his own interview on a different channel, describing how the video didn't show the whole story. But Rachel's story was spreading too. More young people from the streets came forward with similar experiences. An elderly man brought security footage from his shop showing other incidents. A former rookie cop reached out privately, sharing stories of what he'd witnessed before quitting the force. Maya's phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. "You should have minded your own business. Sleep tight." She showed it to the lawyer, who added it to a growing file of threats. But for every threatening message, there were dozens of supportive ones. People offered safe houses, security systems, legal help. That evening, as Maya helped Rachel sort through donated clothes, they watched their story spread across national news. The video had reached millions. Hashtags trended. Protests were being organized. "I never thought anyone would believe me," Rachel whispered, folding a sweater with shaking hands. "All this time on the streets, people just looked through me like I was invisible." Maya squeezed her shoulder. "You're not invisible anymore. None of us are." Later, in Mrs. Thompson's spare room, Maya couldn't sleep. Her phone kept lighting up with notifications, but she'd finally silenced it. The streetlight cast strange shadows on the unfamiliar walls. She thought about her apartment, sitting empty tonight because she didn't feel safe there. Was she brave or just naive? The consequences were rolling in like storm clouds. The shelter's board was meeting tomorrow to discuss the situation. Some donors were threatening to pull funding. Officer Stevens' wife had posted a long Facebook message about how her husband was a family man, a good man, being crucified by social media. But then there were the other messages, the ones that made it all worth it. A mom whose teenage son had similar experiences with police finally felt brave enough to file a complaint. A retired officer wrote about how the video reminded him why reform was so necessary. Community groups were organizing support networks for homeless youth. Change was happening, one ripple at a time. Maya pulled out her journal, a habit from her corporate days that still brought comfort. She began to write, day one after the video. "I'm scared. But maybe being scared and doing it anyway is what courage really means." A text lit up her phone, Rachel checking in. "Can't sleep. But for the first time in forever, I feel like tomorrow might actually be better than today." Maya smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more threats, more difficult conversations. The investigation would drag on. People would take sides, but something fundamental has shifted. As she finally drifted off to sleep, Maya thought about all the other videos out there, unrecorded. All the other stories untold. How one small act of courage had opened a door, and now others were walking through it. Sometimes the hardest part isn't capturing the truth, it's dealing with what happens after you share it. But as Maya was learning, you don't have to face those consequences alone. Community could be found in the most unexpected places, strength in the most unlikely allies. The night deepened, and somewhere in the city, others were watching her video, making their own choices about speaking up or staying silent. The ripples kept spreading, touching lives Maya would never know about. And in that spare room, surrounded by Mrs. Thompson's quilts and the faint smell of baking bread from downstairs, Maya finally understood. This wasn't just about one video or one incident anymore. It was about all the moments that would come after, all the people who would find their voices because someone else spoke first. That thought carried her into sleep, into dreams of a city where everyone's story deserved to be heard, where truth wasn't something to fear. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But for tonight, she knew she'd chosen right. A week had passed since the video changed everything. Maya sat in her makeshift office, really just a corner of Mrs. Thompson's kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of papers and a laptop borrowed from the shelter. The morning sun streamed through lace curtains, casting patterns on the growing pile of documented incidents people had sent her. "Another one," she mumbled, opening an email. This time it was from a college student who'd captured footage of a similar incident near the university. Maya added it to her database, a simple spreadsheet that had grown into something much bigger than she'd ever imagined. Mrs. Thompson placed a fresh cup of tea beside her. "You need to eat something, dear. Can't fight the system on an empty stomach." The old baker's maternal concern had become a constant comfort in this new, uncertain life. Maya smiled weakly, reaching for a warm cinnamon roll. Her phone buzzed. A text from her lawyer. Meeting with the Police Oversight Committee confirmed for 2 p.m. Bring everything. Everything. Maya looked at her collection, dozens of videos, hundreds of written statements, time-stamped photos, official complaint records that had gone nowhere. People had been documenting these incidents for years, but no one had put all the pieces together before. Now they had proof of a pattern. Rachel appeared in the doorway, looking different from the scared girl of a week ago. She'd traded her old hoodie for a donated blazer, her hair neatly braided. The Youth Outreach Center called. They'd want us to speak at their community forum tonight. Maya nodded, adding it to her overflowing calendar. They'd been doing this together, Maya sharing her video, Rachel sharing her story. Somehow, having each other made it easier to face the crowds, the cameras, the questions that never seemed to end. The shelter board had eventually backed them, after the community's overwhelming show of support. Maya's boss had even given her a new title, Community Relations Coordinator. It came with a small raise and the freedom to focus on building what they now called the Accountability Project. Did you see the news? Rachel held up her phone, showing a local headline. Police Department announces new training protocols following viral video. Below it was a picture of Officer Stevens at a press conference, looking uncomfortable as he read a prepared statement about learning from mistakes and building community trust. Maya's hands tensed around her tea mug. The investigation was still ongoing, but changes were already happening. Small ones, maybe, but real. The department had agreed to review its procedures for dealing with homeless youth. 2 other officers had come forward with their own concerns about department culture. But not everyone was happy about the changes. Look at this, Rachel said, sliding onto a kitchen chair. She pulled up a social media post from a police support group. They were planning a rally to support our officers and stop the anti-police agenda. The comment section was filled with angry accusations about Maya and Rachel being professional troublemakers and attention seekers. They don't get it, Rachel sighed. This isn't about being anti-police. It's about being pro-accountability. Maya reached for her notebook, the same one she'd started writing in that first night at Mrs. Thompson's. Its pages were now filled with ideas, contacts, plans. Maybe we need to change how we're telling the story, she said slowly. What if we invited some of the good officers to speak at the forum tonight? Rachel's eyes lit up. Like Officer Chen? The one who's been helping us with the youth outreach program. Maya nodded. Officer Chen had reached out privately after the video went viral, sharing her own frustrations with department culture and offering to help bridge the gap between police and community. She wasn't the only one. There were others in the department who wanted change, but hadn't known how to make it happen. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of preparations. Maya's laptop chimed with new messages. Community organizers coordinating tonight's forum, journalists requesting comments, more people sharing their stories. Each one represented a thread in the growing web of connection and accountability they were building. At 1:30, Maya packed up her evidence for the Oversight Committee meeting. Rachel insisted on coming along for support. As they waited for their ride, they didn't take chances walking alone anymore. Mrs. Thompson pressed a paper bag of fresh pastries into Maya's hands. For the committee, she winked. Nobody can stay angry while eating my apple strudel. The ride to City Hall was quiet. Maya watched the familiar streets pass by, remembering how different everything had looked just a week ago. She'd been so scared then, so unsure. She still was, in many ways, but it was a different kind of fear now. Not the paralyzing kind, but the kind that pushed you forward. Ready? Rachel asked as they climbed the City Hall steps. Maya clutched her folder of evidence. Ready. Inside, the marble halls echoed with their footsteps. Maya's lawyer waited by the committee room doors, looking confident in her pressed suit. Remember, she said quietly, we're not just showing them problems today, we're showing them solutions. Maya touched the notebook in her bag, thinking of all the ideas they'd gathered, community oversight boards, better training programs, partnership initiatives between shelters and police. This meeting wasn't an ending, it was another beginning. As they walked into the committee room, Maya caught sight of their reflection in the window. 3 women of different ages, backgrounds, experiences, united by a choice to speak up instead of look away. Rachel squeezed her hand, and Maya squeezed back. The committee members shuffled their papers, looking down at them with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. Maya took a deep breath and opened her folder. "Thank you for meeting with us today," she began, her voice steady. "We're here to talk about building a better future for our city, and we have some ideas about how to make that happen." Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of light through the high windows. Somewhere in the city, Mrs. Thompson was baking tomorrow's bread, Officer Chen was preparing for her shift, and countless others were watching, waiting, hoping for change. The real work was just beginning. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the community center windows as Maya stood before a room packed with faces, some friendly, others not so much. 1 month had passed since that rainy day outside the shelter, and tonight's town hall meeting would either bridge some divides or deepen them. "We're not here to point fingers," Maya began, her voice carrying to the back of the room. "We're here to find solutions together." She could feel the tension thick in the air. Uniformed officers along one wall, community activists along another, concerned citizens filling every chair between. Rachel sat in the front row, notebook ready. She'd grown into a skilled documenter herself, capturing not just problems but potential solutions. Next to her sat Officer Chen, who'd become an unexpected ally in their push for change. The sight of them sitting together, a former homeless teen and a veteran cop, gave Maya hope. "Last month I posted a video," Maya continued. "But that's not the whole story. Since then, we've gathered hundreds of accounts from all sides. Today, we're going to share what we've learned, and more importantly, what we can do about it." She clicked to the first slide of their presentation. The room hushed as faces appeared on screen, not just civilians who'd experienced harassment, but also officers who'd tried to report misconduct and faced retaliation. Their stories wove together, showing how a broken system hurt everyone it touched. "Look," a gruff voice called from the back. Maya recognized Officer Stevens' partner from that day. "We're out there doing an impossible job. You try dealing with what we deal with." Instead of arguing, Maya nodded. "You're right. That's why we've invited Officer Chen to share her experience implementing the new youth outreach program." Officer Chen stood, her uniform crisp, her expression determined. "When I first saw Maya's video, I was angry," she admitted. "Felt like we were being attacked. But then I started thinking about why I became a cop in the first place, to help people, to make things better. This program, it's letting me do that again." She described how the new approach was working. Officers partnering with social workers, building relationships instead of just responding to calls. Early numbers showed promising results, fewer confrontations, more young people getting connected to services. A man in the audience raised his hand. "That's great for the youth program, but what about regular patrols? My store got robbed twice last year." Maya had been ready for this. She clicked to the next slide, showing crime statistics alongside community engagement numbers. When people trust the police, they're more likely to report crimes, cooperate with investigations, come forward as witnesses. Look at these numbers from cities that have implemented similar reforms. The presentation continued, but Maya watched the room more than her slides. She saw officers nodding at certain points, activists leaning forward with interest at others. The energy was shifting from confrontation to conversation. During the break, Maya slipped outside for some air. The evening was cool, stars just beginning to appear above the city lights. A figure approached. She tensed until she recognized Mrs. Thompson's familiar shuffle. "Brought you some strength," the baker smiled, offering a paper bag that smelled of cinnamon. "You're doing good in there, dear." They're actually talking to each other instead of at each other. Maya peeked in the bag, finding her favorite pastries. "Some days it feels like we're getting nowhere," she admitted. "For every step forward." "Change is like bread dough," Mrs. Thompson cut in. "Looks like nothing's happening for the longest time, then suddenly, rise." She gestured expansively, making Maya laugh. Back inside, the second half of the meeting turned to specific proposals. Rachel presented her research on successful programs from other cities. Officer Chen shared detailed plans for expanding the youth outreach model to other departments. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. When they opened the floor for discussion, all tensions flared. A heated debate broke out about oversight committees and body cameras. Maya watched Officer Stevens shift uncomfortably in his seat as speakers referenced the video that started it all. Then something unexpected happened. An elderly man stood up, leaning on his cane. "Been running my shop downtown 40 years, he announced. "Used to be, I'd call the cops on any kid looked suspicious. Now? I talk to them first. Found out most just need a chance, like my own kids did. Maybe we all need to learn to see different." The room fell quiet, absorbing his words. Maya felt tears prick her eyes, remembering all the moments that had led to this one. The fear when she first pressed record. The nights spent worrying about retaliation. The growing realization that change was possible, but only if people were willing to do the hard work of listening and learning. As the meeting wound down, people lingered in small groups, exchanging contact information and ideas. Maya watched Officer Chen deep in conversation with a teenage activist. Nearby, a shop owner and a shelter worker traded stories about their experiences with the community policing program. Rachel appeared at her side, eyes bright with excitement. "The youth center wants to start a peer support program," she said. "They want me to help run it." Maya hugged her, remembering the scared girl from just a month ago. Now here she was, stepping into leadership herself. The transformation wasn't just happening in their city's systems, it was happening in its people. Later that night, as Maya updated their project database with notes from the meeting, she found herself thinking about ripples again. That first video had been like a stone thrown in still water. But now? Now they were seeing waves of change, powered by hundreds of people choosing to be part of the solution. Her phone buzzed with a message from Officer Chen. "Department approved the expansion. Training starts next month. We're really doing this." Maya smiled, saving the message in her growing folder of small victories. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new resistance, new problems to solve. But tonight, in a room full of people who'd chosen to come together instead of pull apart, she'd seen what was possible. The work wasn't finished, it might never be finished. But they weren't just documenting problems anymore. They were writing a new story, one small change at a time. 2 months had passed, and autumn leaves scattered across the sidewalk as Maya walked to her old workplace. The shelter looked different now. A fresh coat of paint brightened its walls, and new signs advertised expanded services. But the biggest changes weren't visible from the outside. "Look who's back!" Her old boss called out as she entered. He was setting up for today's special event, the launch of their new joint program between the police department and social services. The common room had been transformed, with round tables replacing the old rows of chairs, creating space for conversation rather than confrontation. Hard to believe this all started with one video, he mused, adjusting a banner that read Community First Initiative. Maya touched her phone in her pocket. She still carried it ready to record, but these days she was capturing different kinds of moments. Last week, she'd filmed Officer Chen teaching a self-defense class for homeless youth. Yesterday, it was the opening of a new 24-hour youth center funded partly by police department budget reallocations. "The news crew is outside," Rachel announced, bustling in with arms full of folders. She'd traded her shelter bed for a small apartment and her uncertainty for purpose. As the newly appointed youth advocacy coordinator, she was responsible for training both police officers and social workers in better ways to help young people in crisis. The morning sun filled the room as people began arriving. Maya watched them filter in. Police officers in casual clothes instead of uniforms, social workers, community members, local business owners. Mrs. Thompson arrived with her signature pastries, now a regular fixture at their meetings. Even Officer Stevens was there, looking more relaxed than Maya had ever seen him. "Ready for your speech?" Rachel whispered, nudging Maya's arm. Maya nodded, though butterflies danced in her stomach. Public speaking had become part of her life, but this presentation felt different. They weren't just talking about change anymore, they were showing real results. She stepped up to the podium, looking out at the faces she'd come to know over the past months. 2 months ago, many of us were on opposite sides of what seemed like an unbridgeable divide, she began. Today, we're partners in something remarkable. The projector clicked through slides showing their progress, a 60% reduction in confrontational incidents between police and homeless youth. Dozens of successful interventions where social workers and officers work together. A new rapid response team that paired mental health professionals with trained officers. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," Maya continued. She gestured to a young man in the audience, one of their success stories. Tommy, would you like to share your experience? Tommy stood, his work uniform neat, his voice steady. 3 months ago, I was sleeping in alleys, running from cops. Now I've got a job, a room of my own, and Officer Chen's number on speed dial if I need help. He smiled at the officer who'd become his mentor. Turns out when people see you as human, everything changes. The room erupted in applause, but Maya wasn't finished. She clicked to the next slide, showing their plans for expansion. We're not just fixing problems anymore, we're preventing them. The money saved from reduced arrests and emergency responses is being reinvested in prevention programs. We're creating a model that other cities are asking to learn from. After the presentation, people lingered over coffee and Mrs. Thompson's pastries, sharing stories and plans. Maya found herself in a corner with Officer Stevens, the tension between them finally easing. I watched that video again last night, he said quietly. Couldn't see it clearly before, but I was wrong that day. The way we were trained, it didn't help anyone. This new way. He gestured around the room. This works better. Outside, a group of teens from Rachel's peer support program was setting up for their afternoon session. They painted a mural on the shelter wall, hands of different colors joined together, reaching toward a rising sun. Maya remembered Rachel's words from their first meeting after the video. Nobody believed me before. Now belief wasn't necessary, they had proof. Proof in the numbers, in the stories, in the changed lives. But more than that, they had a new way forward. Her phone buzzed. A message from a neighboring city asking about implementing their program. These requests were coming more frequently now. Maya had started documenting everything, creating a blueprint for change that could be shared. Later that evening, as the sun set behind the city buildings, Maya sat in her old spot at Mrs. Thompson's kitchen table. She'd moved back to her apartment weeks ago, but these evening debriefing sessions had become a cherished ritual. Did you ever think, Mrs. Thompson asked, sliding a fresh cup of tea across the table, that pressing that record button would lead to all this? Maya shook her head, thinking about the scared woman she'd been that day. She hadn't known then that courage wasn't about being fearless, it was about being afraid and acting anyway. She hadn't known that change wasn't about big dramatic moments, but about all the small choices that came after. Sometimes the smallest actions have the biggest ripples, she said, echoing words she'd written in her journal that first night. Mrs. Thompson nodded wisely, pulling another batch of cinnamon rolls from the oven. The warm, sweet smell filled the kitchen, mixing with the evening air drifting through the open window. Somewhere in the city, Officer Chen was starting her night shift, Rachel was leading a youth group session, and countless others were carrying forward the work they'd started together. Maya opened her laptop to answer the latest email requesting their program guidelines. The screen reflected her smile as she began to type. It starts with seeing each other as human. The transformation wasn't complete, it never would be. But they'd found something powerful in the aftermath of that viral video. The understanding that real change happens not in dramatic moments, but in the patient, persistent work of people choosing to do better, day after day after day. The conference room buzzed with energy as representatives from 12 different cities filled the seats. Maya stood at the front, still amazed that people had traveled across the country to learn about their program. 6 months had passed since that rainy day and the video that changed everything. The Community First initiative isn't just a program, Maya began, her confidence growing with each presentation. It's a complete shift in how we think about community safety and support. The slideshow behind her showed familiar faces, Officer Chen teaching a workshop, Rachel leading a youth council meeting, even Mrs. Thompson serving pastries at their monthly community dialogues. A police chief from a neighboring state raised his hand. These results are impressive, but how do you handle resistance from officers who don't want change? Before Maya could answer, Officer Stevens stood up from his seat in the back. He'd become one of their strongest advocates, though it had taken time. Mind if I take this one? He asked Maya. She nodded, stepping aside. Officer Stevens walked to the front, his badge catching the fluorescent light. 6 months ago, I was that resistant officer, he admitted. I thought this program would make our jobs harder, maybe even impossible. I was wrong. He clicked to a slide showing recent statistics. Complaints down 70%, successful interventions up 85%, officer job satisfaction improved by 40%. We're not just policing better, he explained. We're actually making a difference. And you know what? It's why most of us joined the force in the first place." The room absorbed his words. Maya watched faces shift from skepticism to interest. She remembered feeling that same transformation herself, watching hope replace fear as their ideas began working in real time. A social worker from another city raised her hand. "But what about funding? These programs can't be cheap." Rachel stepped forward, professional in her blazer but still wearing her favorite worn sneakers. "Actually, we're saving money," she explained, pulling up the budget charts she prepared. "Every person we help before crisis saves thousands in emergency response costs. Every youth who gets support instead of arrest saves tens of thousands in judicial and incarceration expenses." The morning session flowed into working groups, where visitors shared their own city's challenges and successes. Maya moved between tables, listening to discussions about adapting their model to different communities. Every city had its own needs, its own obstacles, but the core principle remained the same: seeing people as human first. During the lunch break, Maya slipped away to the shelter's new rooftop garden, her favorite quiet spot. The vegetable beds were thriving, tended by shelter residents who'd found peace in growing things. She found Tommy there, watering the tomato plants he'd started from seed. "Big crowd down there," he said, offering her a fresh cherry tomato. "Hard to believe it all started with us, huh?" Maya smiled, remembering him as the scared kid from her first weeks at the shelter. Now he helped run their youth mentoring program, showing other kids they could change their stories too. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't recorded that day," she admitted, watching the city buzz below. Tommy straightened up, wiping soil from his hands. "Someone would have done it eventually," he said. "The system was broken. You just helped us all see it clearly enough to fix it." Back in the conference room, the afternoon focused on implementation strategies. Officer Chen shared their training protocols while Rachel explained their youth advocacy program. Mrs. Thompson had sent boxes of her famous pastries, and Maya smiled watching tough-looking police chiefs bonding over cinnamon rolls. "The key," Maya explained to the group, "is that everyone has a role. Business owners provide job training. Teachers offer tutoring. Officers become mentors. Every person who steps up makes the whole system stronger." A city council member from the coast raised her hand. "But what about the hard cases? The ones who don't want help?" Maya nodded, appreciating the tough question. "That's where our rapid response team comes in," she said, clicking to video clips of their team in action. "When someone's in crisis, they need the right kind of help at the right moment. Sometimes that's a social worker. Sometimes it's medical care. Sometimes it's just someone who will listen without judgment." The video showed Officer Chen talking down a distressed teen while a social worker waited nearby. Another clip captured Rachel's peer support team helping a newcomer find shelter and services. Each scene demonstrated their philosophy in action: meet people where they are with what they need. As the day wound down, Maya watched the visitors exchange contact information, making plans to stay connected as they implemented changes in their own cities. The ripples were becoming waves, carrying possibility across borders and boundaries. Later, in the shelter's common room, the local team gathered for their usual evening debrief. Mrs. Thompson had brought fresh bread, its warm scent mixing with coffee and hope. Officer Stevens was showing Officer Chen some new de-escalation techniques he'd learned from the visiting officers. Rachel sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through feedback forms with her youth council. "We're going to need a bigger conference room next time," Maya's boss commented, looking over the day's attendance sheets. Words getting out. Maya thought about all the pieces that had come together: the community's courage, the officers' willingness to change, the young people's resilience. Each person had brought their own gifts to the transformation, making it stronger, more complete. Her phone buzzed with a message from another city requesting program information. She smiled, remembering how scared she'd been to share that first video. Now sharing had become their strength, each story building on the ones before. Outside, the city lights blinked on as evening settled in. The conference participants were heading home, carrying pieces of their story back to their own communities. Maya imagined similar meetings happening across the country, similar transformations beginning. "Ready for tomorrow?" Rachel asked, joining her at the window. "The news crew wants to do a follow-up story." Maya nodded, thinking about how to tell their continuing story. It wasn't just about one video anymore, or one program, or even one city. It was about showing what's possible when people choose to see differently, act differently, be different. You know what the best part is? Tommy called from across the room, where he was setting up for tomorrow's youth meeting. Now when kids come to the shelter, they're not just getting help. They're seeing what they could become. Maya looked around the room at all the faces that had become family, all the stories that had woven together. The transformation wasn't just in their programs or policies, it was in their hearts, in the way they saw each other and themselves. And somewhere out there, someone else was choosing to act, to speak up, to make change. The story continued, growing stronger with each new voice that joined in. 1 year had passed. Maya stood in front of the shelter, watching the morning sun paint the city in shades of gold. The old brick building wore its age proudly now, its walls covered in community murals, its windows bright with hope. A small garden bloomed where concrete had once cracked, much like the change that had blossomed in their city. "Still can't believe it's been a year," Rachel said, joining her with 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Maya, steam rising in the cool morning air. They had a tradition now of sharing these quiet moments before the day began. Today was special. They were hosting their first national conference on community-based policing and social support. Representatives from over 50 cities would be attending, along with government officials and community leaders from across the country. "Remember when we thought getting through one day was a victory?" Maya smiled, sipping her coffee. The memory of that first viral video felt distant now, like watching a movie of someone else's life. But the lessons stayed with her, shaped everything they built. Inside, the shelter hummed with activity. The main room had been transformed into a presentation space, with breakout areas for workshops and discussion groups. Photos lined the walls, a visual timeline of their journey. There was the first community meeting, tense faces on opposite sides of the room. The Youth Council's first project, painting the shelter walls. Officer Chen's graduation ceremony from their advanced training program. "Look who's here early," Mrs. Thompson called out, pushing through the door with her signature basket of pastries. Even after a year, she insisted on baking for every important event. The news vans are already setting up outside. Maya checked her phone. Messages were pouring in from partner organizations across the country. Their model had spread, taking root in different forms in different cities. Each community adapted it to their needs, but the core remained the same, bringing people together, seeing the humanity in each other. Officer Stevens arrived in his dress uniform, looking nervous but proud. He was leading today's session on police reform, sharing their department's journey from resistance to embrace. "The chief wants to know if you got his speech revisions," he said, straightening his tie. "Tell him to trust himself," Maya replied. "His story matters too." The morning flew by in a blur of welcomes and introductions. Maya watched faces light up with recognition as people connected their online discussions to real faces, real stories. The youth council members moved through the crowd with professional confidence, sharing their experiences and insights. During the lunch break, Tommy gave tours of their new facilities, the 24-hour youth center, the job training workshops, the mental health support offices. "A year ago, I was sleeping under bridges," he told visitors. "Now I'm helping design programs to make sure nobody else has to." Rachel's afternoon presentation drew the biggest crowd. She shared their data, not just numbers, but stories. How their approach had cut youth homelessness by 40%. How emergency calls had dropped by 60%. How officer satisfaction rates had soared. But more than that, she shared their heart. "This isn't just about policies or programs," she explained, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "It's about choosing to see each other. Really see each other. The way Maya saw me that day when nobody else would look." Maya felt tears prick her eyes, remembering that scared girl with the backpack. Now Rachel stood tall, confident, helping others find their voice and their way. The day's final session was held in the garden on the shelter's roof. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant colors as people gathered in circles, sharing challenges and solutions. Officer Chen led a discussion on community engagement, while Mrs. Thompson passed around fresh cookies, the simple act of sharing food breaking down barriers as it always had. "You've built something remarkable here," a visiting police chief said, watching the mixed groups of officers, social workers, community members, and youth all talking easily together. Something real. Maya shook her head. We all built it together. That's what makes it work. As evening settled over the city, the conference participants began to leave, carrying pieces of their story back to their own communities. But the shelter stayed busy. It was still a working shelter after all. New faces came seeking help, finding not just services but a community ready to support them. Maya found herself back in Mrs. Thompson's kitchen, their old debriefing spot. The familiar smell of baking bread mixed with memories of that first frightening night when everything changed. "Would you do it again?" Mrs. Thompson asked, sliding a warm slice of bread across the table, knowing everything that would come after. Maya thought about the hard days, the threats, the setbacks. But she also thought about Rachel's smile when she got her own apartment, Tommy's pride in his garden, Officer Stevens learning to kneel down and talk to scared kids instead of towering over them, Officer Chen creating new training programs, the countless lives touched and changed. "In a heartbeat," she answered. "But you know what I've learned? That video didn't change things. We did. All of us choosing day after day to do better, be better." Her phone buzzed, another city requesting their program guidelines. On the screen, she could see the original video's view count. Millions of people had watched that moment of crisis. But billions more had been touched by what came after, the quiet, steady work of people choosing to make change real. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars. Somewhere, Officer Chen was starting her night shift, checking in on the young people she'd come to know by name. Rachel was probably still at the youth center, making sure everyone had a safe place for the night. Tommy would be locking up the garden, already planning tomorrow's projects. The story hadn't ended. It was still being written, page by page, choice by choice, person by person. And somewhere out there, someone else was choosing to act, to speak up, to make a difference. Maya opened her laptop to answer the latest request for help. The words came easily now. "It starts with seeing each other as human. The rest follows from there." Mrs. Thompson smiled, pulling another loaf from the oven. "That's the real magic, isn't it? Not the big moments, but all the small ones that come after. All the choices to keep going, keep trying, keep believing in better." Maya nodded, thinking of all the lives touched, all the changes made, all the hope built. One video had opened a door, but it was the daily work of countless people that had transformed that opening into real, lasting change. And somewhere in the city, someone else was choosing to be brave, to speak up, to make a difference. The story continued, growing stronger with each new voice that joined in, each new heart that opened, each new hand that reached out to help. The transformation wasn't complete, it never would be. But they'd learned that real change happens not in single dramatic moments, but in the patient, persistent work of people choosing to do better, day after day after day. And in that truth lay both their greatest challenge and their greatest hope.